personally, I'm not all upset with starting out the semester with a little kick in the butt. Okay, a lot of you maybe need a little reality check. You need to read the textbook. You need to take better notes. You know, you can't just sit in class and listen, because some of you do not take notes. Some of you do, some of you don't. The ones who don't take notes, I often wonder, wow, do they really have that good of a memory? Are they really going to be able to remember what I say 3 weeks later on a quiz or on an exam? So you need to take notes. I'm also going to say something about the use of laptops.
I'm going to see if you have what it takes to fill in what you thought.
Okay.
Thank God! This is, and you're nothing! Believe it!
Number 15, 3 distinct regions where agriculture developed independently. All right, your textbook gave 7, and Jared Diamond in the video, he gave it probably 6 or 7. And I've shown you this map, and there's a similar map to it in the textbook. You should have all gotten Fertile Crescent, or Middle East, or Mesopotamia, we accepted, or even Southwest Asia. We accepted 4 answers for this area. China, New Guinea, the video talked about New Guinea as a place where farming developed independently. So those 3 could have been the easiest 3 probably, but we would have accepted several of these other answers as well. Okay, Eastern North America, Mesoamerica or Mexico, the Andes region of South America, West Africa, we would have accepted West Africa. A couple others are kind of dicey, but it doesn't matter. Nobody said Southeast Asia, nobody said Sudanic Africa anyway. But Fertile Crescent, China, New Guinea, Mexico, Andes, maybe West Africa. So plenty of opportunities for that. Okay. All right. Now make sure we corrected it accurately, and make sure the score is fine. And we have only 2 quizzes this semester, which might be a good thing. The results, and as I already said, most of you will do better on the exams, most of you will do much better on the math quizzes, so this will get balanced out. But it's also for some of you it's a little kick as well, because there were a lot of 13s and 14s and a couple single-digit scores. And I don't think it was that hard, folks. I don't think it was that hard. I think you all should have been able to get a 20. So yeah, a little kick in the butt. That's okay. All right, now I'm not letting you keep them, because I want my quizzes out there in the world. So I'm going to actually pick them up from everybody individually to make sure I get all of them. And today I will put the scores in Blackboard for this and for your paper as well. But you should know your scores anyway. Okay. Jonathan, you can look at, I'll give you your score after class, okay? Could you just collect those?
Yeah, sure.
Right, you took it, and you two just pass them. Just 2 of you. now we're talking about Egypt. We may finish this today, I think we will. I don't give a long lecture on Egypt. We've already talked about Mesopotamia. Farming develops in the Fertile Crescent, the river valleys, cities, city-states, kingdoms, all of that in Mesopotamia. Now we're going to talk about Egypt. Next, after we talk about Egypt, we're going to talk about the Indus Valley culture and also northern India. So that's coming up on today, Wednesday. We'll do that on Friday, maybe Monday. But today, Egypt. Egyptian society is based around the Nile River in northwest Africa. Farming, we'll talk about farming. Farming there certainly came from the Fertile Crescent, so it's an example of spread. Farming spread from here to Egypt. It also spread from here to the Indus Valley. So that key theme in Jared Diamond's video of farming develops because people have luck, but then it spreads, and that's one of the things. It also, though, may have spread from elsewhere in Africa, too. I want to say one more thing before we jump in. Your textbook says one core thing about Egypt, because in the chapter is mostly about Mesopotamia and these cities and city-states and kingdoms that were still based on cities. But then it says Egypt is different. Egypt really doesn't have cities, and in Egypt, the center for everything is the king, okay, the pharaoh. So I will unfold that, and I'm just telling you, that's the textbook's take on Egypt. It sets up a contrast between Mesopotamia with its dozens of cities that are competing with one another, whereas Egypt, there are cities, but there are less cities. But in Egypt, everything centers on the king. All right, our first question is, people talk about Egypt today, well, is this a Middle Eastern country or an African country? Well, it's in the continent of Africa, okay. It's not in sub-Saharan Africa, true, it's in northern Africa. It's also, though, it's part of the Middle East, it's part of the Arab world today, part of the Muslim world today. So, but that's all today. Historically, should we view Egypt as a Middle Eastern region or an African region? And I'm going to address this by saying this. Where did the people come from, and where did the farming come from? So that's what we're going to look at. When we look at northern Africa generally, there's a region of northern Africa that our textbook and the map that I've shown you calls the Sudanic region. And prior to and this is now in the Sahara Desert, and I'll show you the map in a second. But before 5000 BCE and well before that, the Sudanic region was habitable. People could live there. There were grasslands, there were some trees, not heavy, dense forests, but there were some savanna areas of grassland and tree mixes. People could live in the Sudanic region. In fact, we've got fossils from way, way, way back that show, yeah, people lived in the Sudanic region. But after about 5000 BCE, the climate changed there and it became hotter and drier, and basically it turns into the Sahara Desert. Okay. Here's the Sudanic area of Africa. The evidence shows us that after 5000 BCE, people who lived here, I mean, they have to move. They can't survive in the desert. And it's becoming the Sahara Desert. They can't live here anymore. Some of them move to the south, okay, deeper into Africa, fine. But some of them also move closer to the Nile River because of the water source. Okay? So they move to the Nile River. So some of the people that make up later Egypt clearly came from the Sudanic region. We also know, though, that it's also clear that some people came from the Fertile Crescent into Egypt. So the people living in Egypt, even way back then, not today, we're not talking about today, the people living in ancient Egypt came from both places. They came from the Sudanic region of Africa, and they came from the Fertile Crescent Middle East. We also know that the farming that developed in Egypt, first of all, they had wheat and barley and sheep and goats and cattle, and none of that is native to the Nile River Valley. It's native to the Fertile Crescent, and in fact to the hills in the northern Fertile Crescent. So the crops and the animals came from the Fertile Crescent. But in Egypt, they also farmed some other crops that aren't from the Fertile Crescent, that seem to have come from farther south in Africa, from the Sudanic region. So in other words, people came from here and moved to the Nile River Valley and brought some plants and animals with them. People came from here to the Nile River and brought some plants, animals, crops, livestock with them. And that's the root of ancient Egypt. So the answer to the question is both. All right? I think it's historically accurate to view Egypt as both a Middle Eastern and an African society. The people come from both places, the culture comes from both places, the farming comes from both places. Now it's centered then in the Nile Valley. I mean, if we want to be really specific, this is really what we should just say is ancient Egyptian society is a Nile Valley society. That's where it developed. It's somewhat isolated to the east and to the west because of the deserts. But it's not isolated to the north and the south because that's where the river flows. It flows from the south to the north, empties into the Mediterranean Sea. Well, that means the river links Africa and the Middle East. So another argument to say it's both is that, again, I'll put up the map one more time here, this over here, okay, again, here's Egypt and the Nile River Valley, and the Nile River and the way Egyptian culture developed along the river links then peoples down here in Africa with peoples up here in the Middle East. Go to the left and the right, and it's pretty desert. There's not much going on over here, but there is stuff going on up here and down here, and the river links them. So again, Middle Eastern and African. Okay, and I already said that last part I already said, that the plants and animals that developed there and were farmed there and domesticated there came from both the Sudanic zone and the Fertile Crescent. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the Nile River itself and how agriculture developed there. I don't have a date for this, but I'm sure it was 8,000 to 7,000 years ago, pretty long ago. This is just a Greek historian once said, an ancient Greek historian said that Egyptian society was the gift of the Nile. And this is very common. This phrase shows up a lot because it's helpful. Egyptian society was based on the river. The villages and towns were all up and down the river. The farming was around the river. The irrigation came from the river's waters. So the Nile River was absolutely crucial for the development of Egyptian society. Here's how it works. The Nile River is a very long river. And most of the water, most of the rain that flows in the Nile River is from much further to the south. I mean, even this map that I've shown you doesn't go far enough. The rain is coming down, way down here in the mountains and the hills of Central Africa. And then that water's flowing in the Nile River And yes, it flows to the north. Some people think that the Nile River is the only river on the planet that flows north. That's not true. There are dozens and dozens of rivers that flow to the north. But anyway, but here it doesn't rain that much, right? Because this is the Sahara Desert, but there's this water flowing through. Well, the thing is that even if it rains torrential rains down here, and there'll be flooding in the Nile River down here, but by the time, I mean, it takes weeks for that water to come up here. And the floods aren't going to be devastating because the waters will kind of spread out over time. So there aren't the same devastating floods here that can happen in Mesopotamia because the Tigris and Euphrates rivers aren't as long and they sometimes flood. So there's not violent flooding. What there is, though, is there is flooding every year, but it's reliable and gentle. Every single year after the rainy season down here, the waters of the Nile do rise, and for several weeks, the waters run high, but then they recede, and as they recede, they deposit silt, all right, nice fertile mud with plenty of organic matter on both sides of the Nile River. And it continues to recede, and that creates fantastic farmland. Fantastic farmland. And folks, it happens every single year. And at the same time, every single year. So it doesn't take farmers very long to figure out that, oh, it's March, the waters are gonna rise, and they do, and they rise, and they stay high for 6 weeks or so, and then they recede, and then we plant. And later we harvest, and we're good, and we do the exact same thing next year, and the year after, and the year after. Okay? It's a reliable agricultural system. And they figure it out quickly and really productively.
What was the deposits you said?
Silt. That was the word I used, S-I-L-T. Just silt. Just mud. Same thing the Arkansas River does when it floods. The result is that the agriculture of Egypt is reliable, productive, and stable. Now, I'm going to back up a little bit. The title of this lecture, Egypt and Nile, the subtitle is A Stable Society. So I've got a thesis going here. And my thesis is that in contrast to Mesopotamia, that is kind of an unstable society because these city-states are in competition with one another, and kingdoms are fighting wars with one another, and kingdoms are rising and falling, and the farming, while productive, is somewhat unstable because there's floods and there's drought in Mesopotamia. Egypt, I'm going to say, is different. Egypt is a stable society. Well, one reason why it's stable, I just said. It's stable because the agriculture provided by the regular flooding and receding of the Nile River provides stable, predictable, reliable, and productive agriculture. They've got plenty of food. Now, because of the way the river works, here's the Nile River, all right? Villages appear on both sides of the river, and just almost continuous, just kind of village after village after village after village, farming villages, and they're all productive. Your textbook then says that there are so many villages, but there aren't that many cities. And in part because it's a nonstop village. And folks, a ribbon of villages. You go another 5 miles in either direction and you're in the desert. Okay, so it's just, about 2 miles on each side of the Nile River is just nonstop villages. Maybe no need for cities. Now remember, your textbook does say that Egypt doesn't have cities. Well, it does have some cities, but maybe only 5 or 6 of significant capital cities or palace cities. The rest is just this nonstop village, which is another example of how reliable the agriculture is. The village life is fine, and it's productive, and it's stable, and it works just fine. Okay, next, political and social structure in ancient Egypt. There's farming in Egypt, 5000 BCE. There's villages, certainly 4000 BCE. But according to the best information we have, there are kingdoms that are developing in Egypt in the 3000s BCE. And the legends tell a story that there are 2 kingdoms in Egypt. Now, go to a map here again. 2 kingdoms. And one is called, or we call it at least, Upper Egypt, and the other is Lower Egypt. Now, just so we're clear on this, why is this Upper Egypt and that's Lower Egypt?
Because it feels like it.
Because of what?
Because it feels like it.
No.
Because it's flow of the Nile.
Because water flows downhill, okay? Shouldn't this be, because maps, that's the top of the map. But we're looking at it this way, all right? Water flows downhill, so the hills are here and the water flows. This is Upper Egypt, and then the water flows downhill to Lower Egypt. Okay, Lower Egypt really is just this area here. That's Lower Egypt. The rest is all Upper Egypt. So there are 2 kingdoms in Egypt, according to the oldest tales, but around 3100 BCE, the king of Upper Egypt conquered Lower Egypt and united the 2. And ever since then, for the most part, throughout ancient Egypt's history, Egypt has been ruled, both Lower and Upper Egypt, ruled by one kingdom. And in fact, the crown of the Egyptian pharaohs is a combination of 2 earlier crowns, a crown for Upper Egypt and a crown for Lower Egypt, and they just took these 2 crowns and sort of remade them, and the symbols of both are in the crown, and that's the crown of the pharaohs, representing the united kingdom. And this happened around 3100 BC. Now, as we cover the next 2,000 years, today, historians and archaeologists divide this 2,000-year span of time into basically 3 kingdoms. We call it the Old Kingdom, maybe the Archaic Kingdom, but then the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom.